Okay, so this is chapter 4, PowerPoint part 2. I'm going to do slides 1 to 30 in this video, and then I'll do another video on this part from 31 to 54. So we just finished talking about the epithelial tissues, and we got through all of the epithelial tissues, and the next primary tissue type is the connective tissues. Now again, this is a miscellaneous catch-all category because anything that's not an epithelium, a muscle, or a nervous tissue falls in this group. Okay, so it's going to be the most varied. So connective tissues have special cells, they have extracellular proteins, and they have, it says, a fluid called a ground substance. It's not always a fluid, we're going to learn. Okay, now if we take the cells out of the picture, the things that the cells make that are extracellular become the most important part of this tissue, and it's called the matrix. So we take the ground substance and the protein fibers, and that's what gives us our matrix. And that's the difference from one connective tissue to another, because they work very, very differently. And so most of these tissues have more matrix than they do cells. I want you to go, there's a shorter video on connective tissues that I made for lab, and it goes through how we name the cells and how we name the fibers, and I'll touch on some of those in this, but it'd be really important for you to go watch that shorter video. It's only like a 17-minute video. Okay, so the matrix is going to take up the majority of the volume and determines the function of each of the particular connective tissues. The functions of connective tissues as a group is to build the framework of your body. You'll find that bones belong in this group. Bones and cartilage and ligaments and tendons, so the things that actually hold you together. Some of the connective tissues transport fluids and dissolved materials because guess what? Blood is a connective tissue. They protect delicate organs. They support, surround, and interconnect other tissues. They store energy reserves, especially triglycerides, because guess what? Fat is a connective tissue. You see the pattern here? And of course, they defend the body from invading microorganisms by being a barrier in some cases. Okay, so the categories. It's not as cute and as easy as epithelium. Because epithelial tissues were nothing but a bunch of cells, we only had to worry about the shape of the cells and how many rows. Connective tissues, it's all about the matrix. So we have to have different groupings according to the matrix, okay? So the three groups that are major are connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissues, and supporting connective tissues, okay? So these are the three groups. Under each of these come many, many subtypes. You need to know all of the subtypes and their characteristics. So connective tissue proper has a lot has fibers and ground substance, and you're going to classify them again by whether there are more fibers than ground substance or less fibers than ground substance. If you have few fibers and lots of ground substance, it's going to be called a loose connective tissue. The fibers are loosely floating around. Okay? Examples will be fat and areolar tissue and reticular tissue. If you have almost all fibers, it's very filled with fibers, it's dense with fibers, it's going to be called a dense connective tissue. Tendons and ligaments are dense. Now, cells that we are going to see. The first part of the cell name tells you which tissue or what part of the tissue, and the second part tells you what it does for the matrix. So a fibroblast, the suffix blast means to build matrix. A fibroblast are going to be the most abundant cells in all of our connective tissue propers. They're going to secrete all of our protein fibers. And they're also going to secrete hyaluronan, which is hyaluronan. I say hyaluronic acid, it's much easier to say, which is kind of like a glue. It draws water and it holds things together. Now, after they've done making fibers for a while, they can become fibrocytes, which are just living in the matrix. And they live there and they maintain the fibers, but they're not building the fibers from scratch. Adipocytes are specifically in adipose tissue. They are fat-storing cells. And each cell stores a big fat droplet in an area called a fat vacuole. Again, you want to watch the lab connective tissue video so you can see these. Mesenchymal cells are stem cells that are inside the connective tissue proper that will respond to injury or infection by becoming whichever kind of cell they need to become. A fibroblast, if you need to make more fibers to respond to injury. A macrophage, which is a kind of like a white blood cell that gobbles things up, kind of related, that would help fight infection, something like that. Melanocytes would only be in the skin or hair, and they are going to make the brown pigment melanin. We'll talk more about melanin in chapter 5. Now, the fibers, I've said this a couple times, there are 3 different kinds of protein fibers that you'll find in connective tissues. Collagen fibers, reticular fibers, and elastic fibers. These are all made of proteins, and they are all kept outside the cells because guess what? The fibers are bigger than the cells that make them. Collagen fibers are like molecular rope. They are the most common kind of fiber we find in connective tissue proper. They are long, straight, and unbranched, twisted, strong and flexible, but they do not stretch. And their big thing is they can resist force in a single direction. So we're going to use them to create connective tissues that need to resist force in one direction, like a tendon or a ligament. Reticular fibers are more like molecular packing peanuts, or like Extracellular, this little stringy, papery stuff. You use it to fill a bunch of empty space. It can make a network of fibers that can make sort of like a filter or a net. They're strong and flexible. They are not as strong as collagen, but they can resist force in many directions because they're kind of like a big tangled mess. They stabilize cells, the parenchyma, and structures. Example, around every organ you might have a layer of reticular fibers that forms a sheath or a covering. Elastic fibers are made of the protein elastin, and they're like molecular bungee cord. They're kind of like little tiny slinkies, little springs that you can stretch, and they will recoil and pull themselves back up. The elastic ligaments of vertebrae have a lot of elastic fibers in them. Now, most of your tissues are going to have collagen, maybe with one of these other protein fiber types, but it's the ratios that are important. Which one is the dominant fiber? So this is a cartoon. There is no tissue that exactly looks like this, because we got a lot of stuff going on here. But this is to kind of show you that the very largest fiber type is the collagen fiber, followed by the elastin fibers, and then this kind of webby stuff up here are the reticular fibers. And these are some of the cells. Mast cells are an immune cell, a white blood cell that helps fight infection. Plasma cells also from the immune cells. Macrophages kind of gobble things up. Here's a melanocyte. Here are adipocytes. Here are blood cells. So this is kind of an everything diagram. It most closely resembles areolar tissue, as we'll see in a few minutes, but this is just an artist idea of how many different things from connective tissue proper can I stick in one diagram, okay? Now, again, connective tissue has a ground substance and it has fibers. If you put those two together, you get the matrix of that particular connective tissue. The ground substance is clear, colorless, and viscous. That means it's kind of thick. It's thicker than water, and it fills up the spaces between the cells. Now, actually, it can be everything from a thick fluid all the way to a cement-like stuff in bone. All of that would be considered the ground substance. Loose connective tissues are often used as packing materials, cushions, and energy storers. So in our connective tissue proper loose categories, we have 3. We have areolar tissue, adipose tissue, and reticular tissue. Areolar tissue is the least specialized. It kind of looks like that artist diagram we saw a minute ago. It has a thick liquid ground substance, lots of elastic fibers and collagen fibers, and one of its jobs is to help hold capillaries in place, like under your skin. So here is a diagram and an actual photomicrograph of areolar tissue. Notice low for lab test, and there are diagrams on the A&P resources site and in my PowerPoint that will actually be used for the lab test. So you definitely want to look at those. The thickest reddish pink fibers are collagens. The thinner black fibers are elastins. And the very, very fine fibers are reticular fibers. You also need to know the fibrocytes or fibroblasts. Adipose tissue is our official A&P name for fat. The cells are called adipocytes, and they do not undergo mitosis. So this is a weird thing. Pretty much all adults have the same number of fat cells. Obviously, we don't all have the same body shape. The difference is how much fat is being stored in each of your fat cells. So when you lose weight, you lose the volume of fat in each cell, but you don't lose the number of cells. So those cells will shrink as you begin to use up those lipids as energy. They are mesenchymal cells, and they also divide and differentiate that are in your adipose tissue to make more fat cells when more storage is needed. Isn't that sad? Even if you undergo liposuction, it is only temporary because these cells are basically fat stem cells, and they will replace any fat cells that you have removed. Oh, so sad. Now, fat comes in two varieties. White fat, which is on most of us, which is actually yellow in color. Its job is insulation, energy storage, and cushioning. Brown fat is only found in new babies and very young children. And it's brown because it has so many more mitochondria in there. It is a powerhouse. It's a high fuel used to heat up their bodies until they're ready to regulate their own body temperature. So it's kind of like a blanketing fat with lots of available ATP stored in those chemical bonds that can be used. So here is white fat. And notice that the cell is pretty much filled with one giant fat vacuole with one fat droplet. So the nuclei of the cells are kind of shoved to the side. All organelles and nuclei are not in the center of the cells. They're kind of shoved off the side. We can see the fibers between them. So there are collagen fibers here. And how could I tell the difference between this and simple squamous epithelium? Well, the nuclei on the simple squamous would be in the middles. Okay? Know this for lab tests. Okay, the last of our proper loose tissues is reticular tissue. This is not one you're going to learn for the lab test, but it provides support for organs and tissues. It can form a three-dimensional kind of filter. And so it's going to be found in organs that are responsible for filtering, like your liver, your kidneys, your spleen, your lymph nodes, and your bone marrow. Now this one's really cool looking. This is a little bit from the liver. To me, it kind of looks like a grapevine with individual little grapes hanging on it. Okay, so the fibers would be the vine part, and then these would be cells that are hanging out, the fibrocytes. So you can see how this would be a really good filter for catching things. All right, so those were the loose ones. Here are the dense ones. They're also called collagenous tissues because they're all filled with collagen. And we have the first two, dense regular and dense irregular, are all collagen. Dense elastic is just elastic. Now, the difference between dense regular and dense irregular, we already know from the word dense, we have lots of fibers and little ground substance. Regular or irregular has to do with the direction that the fibers are laying. If they are all laying the same way, parallel to each other, then we call it dense regular connective tissue. And we'll use this in ligaments and tendons and an aponeurosis. This is a new word for you. This is a tendon that's flattened out into like a big covering or sheet. So instead of looking like a string, this kind of tendon is more like a big sheet, a big white sheet that will connect a muscle to a bone. So here is a diagram of dense regular, and here is an actual photomicrograph. So you can see all this wavy pattern, all of these are the individual collagen fibers, and they're all going basically the same way. The purple elongated ovals are the nuclei of the fibroblasts making these fibers. This one will be on your lab test. Dense irregular means we take the collagen fibers and rather than putting them all one way, we put them every way because we need strength in every direction. So we're going to do this in the dermis. We're going to put it around cartilages in the form of the perichondrium and around bones in the periosteum. And we'll even take some of our very special organs and we'll make a capsule, which is a thicker covering around the outside of the organ. And ones that we are going to do that for are the liver, kidneys, and spleen. So this is what it would look like under the under the microscope. Here's a photomicrograph. So here's the diagram. Here's the real thing. This is down deep in the reticular layer of the dermis, and we have collagen fibers going every direction. The last of our dense tissues is dense elastic, and it's all elastic. And we're finding this in a few places like the ligaments of the spinal vertebrae, the ligaments supporting the penis, the ligaments in the transitional epithelium, and in blood vessel walls. So it looks very much like dense regular. The only difference is that this would be elastin versus collagen, which is why we did not put this one on the lab test. Okay. Now, jobs of connective tissues in general. They are supposed to provide strength and stability. They maintain the positions of the organs and give us places for nerves and blood vessels and lymphatic vessels to run through. So we are going to take a connective tissue and we're going to have them in different layers throughout the body. And we're going to call each one a fascia. As plurals, they are fasciae. And you've probably seen these if you've ever cleaned meat. I know it's kind of gross to talk about meat when we're talking about anatomy, but meat is muscle. So there are 3 layers of fascia in our body, just between our hypodermis of our skin and the next layer down. There is the superficial fascia. And then on the coverings over the muscles, we'll have a deep fascia. And then after we get past the muscles and bones and we're heading towards a cavity, we will have a subserous fascia. This is the thickest, hardest one. All right, so here is your body wall. So here is the skin. There's the hypodermis. We know we got a lot of fat on that. And we see our layer of our hypodermis here is our superficial fascia. Then just under that, but on the surface of the muscle, we have deep fascia on either side of the muscle, here on this side of the muscle. And then outside of, or I guess deep to that, towards the center of the body, we have our subserous fascia. Now, deep fascia and subserous fascia, you may know them as the tough coverings on meats, especially subserous fascia has another common name. It's silver skin. So if you've ever made a rack of ribs, you know that one side on the inside of the rib cage, silver skin, you cannot chew it, you cannot cook it and have it become tender. You have to remove it. Otherwise, people will be gnawing on it forever. Okay? So those are our fascias. All right, so I'm going to stop there for this part of the PowerPoint, and we will pick up at slide 31 in the next video.